Hi there, my name is Dr. Katie VanValin, and on this week's episode of Beef Minutes, we're going to continue our conversation about utilizing corn silage in the diets of beef cattle. So I'm actually a pretty big fan of using corn silage in beef cattle diets because I find that it's a really versatile ingredient that we can feed to multiple classes of cattle. So after we've put up our corn silage, the first thing that we need to do is go ahead and get a sample of that silage after we've allowed it to ferment for about 4 to 6 weeks. That way we can send that off to the lab and get an energy and protein values on that corn silage. Corn silage is a really nice source of energy, especially when I think about our cow herds over the winter. Corn silage is going to be anywhere from about 40 to 55% grain. And so that's something that you've got to keep in mind when we think about actually feeding corn silage out. So if I was going to be feeding 10 pounds of dry matter of corn silage to our beef cows, that's about the equivalent of feeding about 5 pounds of corn to them. So I always want people to kind of keep that in the back of their mind when we think about utilizing corn silage, is that there is a fair amount of grain in there, but it also serves as a forage source for our ruminant animals. So because there is a decent amount of grain in corn silage, and because fermented feedstuffs are often novel to our cattle, it's important that we adapt them to corn silage-based diets over a period of 10 to 14 days. So although corn silage is a good source of energy and a forage base for our cattle, it is deficient in crude protein. So most corn silages are going to be somewhere in that 7 to 8% crude protein range. If we think about the crude protein requirements of our cattle, growing cattle are going to require 12 to 14%, and our mature cows are going to require anywhere from 7 to 11%, depending on their stage of production. Now, here's the thing with corn silage, and I want to break this down just a little bit more, is because we're often guilty of just talking about crude protein requirements of our cattle, and that's often because that's a simple number to understand, and when we send our feedstuffs off to the lab, we get a crude protein value back. But we need to break down protein a little bit further because we're dealing with ruminant animals, and so of that protein that our animal consumes, a fraction of it is going to be what we call ruminal degradable protein, or rumen degradable protein, RDP, and another fraction of it's going to be rumen undegradable protein, or RUP. So the RDP, as the name suggests, is degraded in the rumen, and it can be picked up and utilized by the rumen microbes. Then eventually those rumen microbes will actually wash out of the rumen and down into the small intestine, and now our animals have a chance to utilize that protein source and absorb it at the small intestine. Now, our UP, rumen undegradable protein, escapes the rumen without being picked up by the rumen microbes and gets to the small intestine, where it can also be utilized by the ruminant animal. So when we actually talk about the protein requirements of our cattle, they actually have a metabolizable protein requirement, and that is the protein that actually shows up at the small intestine for our cattle to utilize. So metabolizable protein is made up of that microbial protein, those microbes that wash down out of the rumen, and the rumen undegradable protein fraction from our feedstuffs. So corn silage happens to be really high in rumen degradable protein. So in order to optimize performance of cattle on a corn silage based diet, it's important that we supplement crude protein that is high in rumen undegradable protein, or RUP. Some potential sources for that would be soybean meal or dried distillers grains, and of course we're going to have to weigh the economics of different options as well based on what current feed prices are. So I know that was a kind of a long-winded explanation, but I think it's important to understand that it's more than just that crude protein number that we need to consider. Additionally, corn silage is going to be marginal when we think about the calcium to phosphorus ratio, and so depending on what other feed sources we're using in the diet, we may need to consider a supplemental source of calcium to balance out the calcium to phosphorus ratio. Remember, our goal there is to get a 2-to-1 ratio of calcium to phosphorus. So I say all that to encourage you to work with a ruminant nutritionist if you are considering adding corn silage to your diets. Again, it's a really great ingredient. I like it a lot, but there are some things that we need to consider, and it's important that we're feeding a balanced diet to our cattle in order to meet their requirements and optimize performance. Thank you for joining us on this week's episode of Beef Minutes.